Okay, welcome to session 4. It seems to me that we are hijacked by other session across the hallway, the strategic distrust or trust between U.S. and China. But anyway, this session is about what kinds of security architecture we like to have in the region. So for that, we have 5 speakers from representing different geographical entity. So each speaker will speak about 7 minutes, and they will come back with Q&A and discussions. And then I will open the floor. Actually, I have to forget to introduce myself. My name is Choi, Vice President of Asan Institute. So on my left, actually, I will briefly introduce each speaker. Dr. Paul Evans, professor at University of British Columbia. He's from Canada. And we have Professor Ken Jimbo. He's from Keio University, representing Japan. And we have Mr. Scott Snyder, Senior Fellow at Council on Foreign Relations from the United States. And we have Professor Teng from Chinese Institute of International Studies. And actually, it's quite fortunate to have someone who actually from the European continent, from NATO, actually Mr. Ghinst from NATO. Actually, he's the head of global partners and contact countries section at NATO headquarters in Brussels. Without further ado, let me invite Dr. Paul Evans for his comments. What is the observation of the security architecture since the end of maybe from 1945, we have been relying on purely bilateral alliances up to now, but actually bilateral alliance, whether that can be further sustained into the future, or whether we can think about alternative security architecture. For example, Philip yesterday mentioned the collective security system is much more desirable. But for example, 1994, the South Korean government proposed Northeast Asia Security Dialogue, but we have not made any progress at all. But the current Park Geun-hye administration put forward Northeast Asia Peace and Cooperation Initiative. Whether that can be attainable or not, what kinds of factors which can facilitate or derail the achievement of multilateral security cooperation ahead of us. Please.
Well, thank you so much, and we're a relatively small group and can be perhaps even a little bit less formal than some of the other sessions. You know, we meet at a time of a rather sober mood in both the discussion of political and security issues, but also at this conference on economic issues. For those of you who have been sitting in on sessions recently, there's many cool winds blowing. And I'd like to take my remarks on how we might respond to some of those cool winds and where there might be a way forward. Last night, Mr. Stevens at the dinner talked about our era as an era of multipolarity without multilateralism. And if I reframe slightly what he said, I heard him talking about multicentrism without effective multilateral governance. So for those of us who have been advocates of multilateral processes as a necessary part of way of moving forward in this region, it's a bit of a time of frustration, uncertainty, maybe even despair that peace and prosperity in this part of the world can be built on multilateral foundations that are the necessary way of the future. Well, there's a wonderful quote by a singing group called the Eagles. How many of you in this room know the Eagles, the singing? Okay.
Oh, good.
Well, one of their songs has a great line in it. You see it your way, I see it mine, but we both see it slipping away. And a little bit in island disputes and other issues in the region, there's a wee bit of the Eagles magic or the Eagle story happening. For those who are interested in trying to promote multilateralism, it's a tough time. And it's ironic because never in Asia's history have there been more multilateral institutions. The last 25 years have erected an architecture that is as complex as the downtown skyline in Seoul. Looking out my window from the hotel here, I saw many different kinds of buildings, from churches through higgledy-piggledy buildings through beautiful new skyscrapers. And in some ways, the architecture, the regional security architecture, is dense and complicated. The challenge is it's not working to solve some of the issues that are before us or might even be leading us in the right direction in the longer term. But in terms of complexity, this is not an underdeveloped part of the world. East Asia, Southeast Asia. Northeast Asia is the toughest of the domains. But Asia-Pacific multilateralism has been built in large part through Southeast Asia. ASEAN-led efforts, including the East Asia Summit process, including the ASEAN Defense Ministers meetings, etc. They haven't cracked the tough nuts in Northeast Asia, but have been the only effective foundation for broader discussion of confidence, preventive diplomacy to some extent, and getting the habits of dialogue and consultation in place. Well, having said that, it's a time of reassessment. In Southeast Asia, there is meeting after meeting now on the subject of regional security architecture. What's working? What's not working? What do we need? Fewer meetings? More meetings? Should there be more track 2 activities in support? Everyone's asking the question and everyone sees problems. Some see problems in the design of institutions in the region, all of which depend upon the idea of high levels of cooperation with low levels of institutionalization, something that's quite a distinctive approach that may or may not be working. Some find these to be impossible circumstances, that you can't get into core issues of security without getting at sovereignty, which is sensitive and very, very hard to get at, particularly in Northeast Asia. And some see it as a failure of leadership. There is no money in this region, goes the argument. There are no two countries that can stand as big powers to lead things forward, and we don't have the individuals. Whatever of those arguments are correct, I'm going to make an argument that the biggest challenge is the failure of the principal idea of multilateral cooperation, and that it's time in the security front to revisit it. Cooperative Security 1.0, as it was created in the early 1990s, what was the background to the ASEAN Regional Forum? What was the background to some of the North Pacific Cooperative Security Dialogue activities, Northeast Asia collaboration activities? It was built on some interesting ideas that I think were best encapsulated by the thinker Sato Yukio, a Japanese who talked about the creation of a multiplex security order in the region. Combination of bilateral alliances, unilateral preparedness, multilateral dialogue mechanisms for trust and confidence building. My sense is that it's time for the region, and the region is beginning to get into something that we might call Cooperative Security 2.0, that goes a step beyond it. We've heard a lot at this meeting about E.H. Carr, a theorist of what went wrong in Europe between 1919 and 1939. Well, his idea of the harmony of interests was, as he saw it, what led to World War II because institutions failed. Right now, I think we have an opportunity, as we just heard in the session with James Steinberg and others that many of us just attended a few moments ago, that there's a bigger question now about what kind of roadmap and what kind of security institutions are needed in the next phase. And I would, the fundamental issue is the structural change. This is not just debate over how to handle particular issues, but how to handle a power transition in the region and a rise of China. This is the new factor in 2014. It was a little different than it was in 1990. And in Cooperative Security 2.0, as we're framing it, we think it's a chance to look at where we would like to see multilateral processes leading. And in general terms, the discussion is not about regional security architecture, but regional security order. And a regional security order, as we're sort of looking at it, there's four possibilities in this region in light of circumstances today. One of them is hegemony. We're going to have continued, perhaps, American primacy. Some see a rising Chinese hegemony, a Middle Kingdomism coming. Possibilities, and that many realists would feel it's the best bet. We just don't know which one of those is going to be dominant. There's another way of cutting it into it, which we got very close to in our last discussion, which is a concert system, where great powers essentially come to some agreement on issues, and that can be the path to settlement of them and to management of issues. There's a third idea of security community. This is the idea that war is unthinkable. ASEAN is aspiring towards a security community. We don't think that any of those three are the most ideal future. That the ideal future is something we're calling a consociational security order. And a consociational security order comes out of comparative politics. It's the idea that in an area of complexity, deep cultural, social, political differences, that you can build a system that the great, the middle, and the small can live within if it's functioning around several key principles. And those principles have to do with self-restraint. They have to do with a common interest in maintaining an order that is to the benefit of all, or at least the benefit of most, and that it is reassurance, self-restraint mechanisms are crucial. And let me end by three dimensions. And when I mention Cooperative Security 2.0, this is a process of meetings and discussions we've been having over the last 2 years with Chinese think tanks and Ministry of Foreign Affairs on what Madam Yao in the last session was pointing at, what can be a new structural objective. So Cooperative Security 2.0, consociationalism, as mentioned in Vice Minister's speeches in China recently, is potentially a different way of framing the challenge. And I'll end with three concepts that we're trying to dig at in a new way through consociationalism. One is the concept of confidence and a revisiting of what confidence means in an era of uncertainty because of structural change, because of a rise of China. We're looking at trust, just as they're doing across the hallway at this point, but through a perspective that is looking at trust as a 7-step process. But finally, we're looking at what we think is a necessary ingredient of a new security order, and that's empathy. The capacity to see issues through the lens of other players. To end, Mr. Togo yesterday gave a wonderful story about An, the Korean hero, who also assassinated a Japanese leader. An's story is a remarkable one. It can be a beginning point for a discussion of differences. It also can be a discussion point for beginning a conversation on where others see a particular problem. So the argument is that in Europe, in the ending of the Cold War, empathy was ultimately a kind of precious psychology and approach that is necessary for confidence and trust to work. So with political psychology, work with some of our Chinese friends, we're trying to look forward to making multilateralism work better by a different destination point and by revisiting some of the core concepts that haven't yet worked, even with Korean push on trust and trustpolitik. Let's go back into them deeper and get some ideas right before we move forward again.
Okay, thank you, Professor Evans, for suggesting Cooperative Security 2.0 and Consociated Security Order. That's quite interesting concept and proposal. So it seems to me that while recognizing differences, we can shoot for some commonalities in our interest. So also you mentioned about confidence and trust. It's a key, one of the key elements, and empathy. That's maybe the most important one among three, maybe. Now, I'd like to invite Professor Jimbo for his comments.
Thank you very much. I'd like to begin by thanking Asan Institute and also Vice President Choi for inviting me to this very important gathering. Is mic on? Is that right? Everybody listen? All right.
Is it working?
Okay. Thank you. I think Paul Evans made a wonderful presentation laying out the new look at the security order and also associated with new security, cooperative security concept 2.0. It's been, I think, wonderful expose for the further discussion. And let me offer my version of deciphering what the dynamics of what's been going on in Asia-Pacific region since we actually had a somewhat dichotomy or binomial perception of the alliance mechanism plus complementary mechanism of promoting the multilateral security cooperation. And a lot of countries in the regions are currently diversifying the security ties and the security mechanisms beyond that binomial mechanisms. And these are really multiplex mechanisms which need to have a closely look at it. And this, I think, diversification derives from three major aspects. And number one is all about the primary source is the hedging behavior against the critical uncertainties associated with the rise of China. And this really leads the many countries to diversify its security ties within this region and beyond. And I think the second emerging trend is the emerging of the intra-spokes cooperation. It used to be the US-led security mechanisms. Every allies and plans are trying to increase its security cooperation and interoperability primarily with the United States. But recently, many of the allies and friends are deepening its security cooperation within those allies and partners, and which also becomes the basis of the wider triangular multilateral mechanisms. For example, US, Japan, Australia, and US, Japan, ASEAN, and Korea, US, Australia, and these are the, I think, emerging trilateral mechanism which we didn't have during the Cold War. And that is also important because it's being made through the connecting of the missing links of the hub and spokes mechanism. These are the second features. And I think we also been seeing the emerging regional capacity to deal with its own problems, especially dealing with primarily on the non-traditional security issues, such as HADR, humanitarian assistance and disaster relief, dealing with the transnational organized crime, and also counter piracy and other related maritime security efforts. And these issue areas are increasingly being dealt by the countries the concerned in those areas. So these are, I think, three kind of motivation and changes that we are seeing in past decade. And I think these diversification of security ties are seemingly create the three layers of the security architecture in this region. And what I mean by three layers starts from the first layer, and that consists of, as I already mentioned, that the networks of the US alliance and partnerships, and also alliance plus multilateralism. And we've all discussed about the US pivot in this region, but augmentation of the US forces, especially in Southeast Asia and Australia, and all those access arrangement and the rotational force presence would be, seen in this category. So this is the emerging, first layer of security cooperation. And the second layer, which I placed a huge importance on this, within this architecture, is the functional and task-oriented initiatives and mechanisms within this region, and which includes HADR joint exercises and trainings, intelligence sharing among the members, and also the capacity building, especially which is going on in Southeast Asia. And something that is distinct from the first layer is that the second layer is the membership is very flexible. And China, Vietnam, Australia, India are all participants of those multilateral HADR types of exercises. Even the US-led, originally US-led mechanisms and exercises such as US-Thai, Cobra Gold, US-Philippine, Valitacans are now being multilateralized, open for participation, including Chinese PLA as well. So this is a quite important mechanism for increasing the interface of the military to military mechanism beyond the layer one allied based relationship. This is I think emerging area we really need to focus upon. And the third area is the multilateral security framework and the dialogue processes. It's been on the slow progress, but through the the intention of creating the legally binding rule-based mechanism, especially what's been going on in South China Sea, is a very, very important processes. The third layer still has a huge importance as a part of this architecture. And what I try to mean here is that it is very important for three layers to develop congruently with each other. And while layer one plays a primary role to develop the joint and collective capacity, mainly for the deterrence and also for creating the regional denial capability vis-a-vis emerging powers, but also it is very important to increase the interface of the military to military cooperation among all concerned parties. And I think here the primary target is the engagement and the involvement of the Chinese. And the third, to this end, it is very important to support creating more effective and capable regional institutions through having practices of the layer one and layer two. And I would like to say two caveats here. And I think these three layers are closely interconnected with each other, but at the same time, I think that each layer has to be independently resilient. For example, if something happened like typhoon in Haiyan, in Leyte, in Philippines, there are disaster relief operations, and every major powers would like to provide the rescue operations. If I was a Chinese leader, I will send a full package to the Leyte immediately after what happened. And that is the division between, their concept on the layer one. There has been, a lot of tensions between China and Philippines over the maritime security issues. But at the same time, if you look at the layer two, that is a more like an issue-oriented humanitarian operation that can go independently without, taking so much concern over those bilateral relationship. And also what happened between Japan and Korea over the operation of the South Sudan was also fit into the category of the layer two, and which is humanitarian operations and peacekeeping. And what happened last December was that the Korean forces were short of the ammunitions, and the Japanese self-defense forces was willing to provide to the help the Korean forces by providing the ammunitions. It has been appreciated on the ground, but when it comes to the soil, it was suddenly become politicized. And this is something that we really need to overcome. Even though we have a huge political problems behind the scene of the Japan-Korea relationship, that doesn't have to go within the framework of the layer two. That's what I mean by they have to be independently resilient. And finally, I also like to emphasize is within this the whole architecture, the hedging itself is not the ultimate policy goal. But I think it is a tool to shape the regional order, which Professor Evans has already mentioned. And I think within this context that the U.S. rebalance is often, mistakenly perceived as to contain China. But having those kind of three-layered structure, and rebalance concept can go to every layers. That has a military context, that has a kind of more participation to enhance those military exercise context. And also, United States has declared that they will increase the presence in the dialogue process as well. So I think this kind of layered architectural understanding of the Asia regional order is on the rise, and I think it is very important to see those kind of multiplex, which I really appreciate that you mentioned Sato Yukio in this context, but the emerging new meanings of multiplex mechanism is so important in this region. I'll stop here.
Thank you, Professor Jimbo, for suggesting three layers. But it seems to me that maybe the most challenging one is how we can connect the first layer and the second layer is quite challenging. How we can overcome the Chinese reservation, having the U.S.-centered cooperation among the countries. So that actually leads me to ask Scott to say something on multilateral security cooperation, U.S. understanding of that.
U.S. understanding. Well, I will try to do that, but I think first I have to offer a disclaimer because I'm not really a specialist on multilateral security. I usually read Paul Evans and Ken Jimbo to learn what to think about those issues. But what I have done is to watch the challenge of multilateralism through the lens of the Korean Peninsula. And so, you know, what I've learned about multilateralism, I really have to thank North Korea for teaching me by being one of the biggest catalysts for promoting multilateral cooperation in the region over the course of the past 2 decades. And in fact, that challenge, I think, has really driven a lot of practical efforts. So in a way, I'm going from practical experience and trying to maybe build the theory versus going the other way. And really, I think the best place, I also thought that Philip Stevens' talk last night was very interesting. And one of the things that caught my ear that I think is important for us to dig into related to this subject is his assertion that the absence of collective security arrangements is a factor that can fuel distrust and that can lead to war. And it raises the question, basically the decades-old question of why not a regional security collaboration in Northeast Asia. And so I wanted to really try to grapple with that just a little bit because I think and of course now that assertion that multilateral security cooperation can be effective as a hedge is also under challenge because of what's happening in the Ukraine. But I think that what we see is that really multilateralism is an instrument of diplomacy, not an end state. And so we have to look at root causes. And I think that one of the interesting challenges for East Asia and Northeast Asia in particular is how you grapple with the root causes that go beyond the challenges of trying to just get the form right. Actually, South Korea has been a leader over the course of the past 2 decades in trying to propose forms of regionalism, regional multilateral cooperation, since Notayu on up to now Park Geun-hye and NAPSI. But the form is insufficient without addressing the substance behind the multilateral cooperation. Very much appreciate Paul's observations on some of these challenges. And I want to lay out some other additional problems or challenges that we have to grapple with. And I think that one of them is the issue of identity in Northeast Asia and the existence of national identity gaps where we have very clearly states who in many cases have designed their purpose as being in opposition to others in the region. And that, I think, is a particular challenge because it really is going to be a generational project to overcome or shift national identities. A good example is Ralph Casa from yesterday, talking about, well, how should Abe talk about history? And the need to identify national identity in Japan's post-war history rather than in its pre-war history. I think a second challenge that makes it particularly difficult for Asian states to achieve multilateral security cooperation is actually related to what Paul had to say about order and the fact that status and hierarchy have been components of East Asian conceptions of order. And so it means that just getting an equivalent dialogue that includes all the players in the room is not going to be, it's necessary, but it's not going to be sufficient to enable Asian states to grapple with these issues without a context that provides order. I think the third factor is related to the fact that we have these security dilemmas that are growing, and they can't be managed simply by establishment of regimes. It may be possible to manage or regulate conflict through some of these efforts to establish an order, but I think that basically in Asia, one of the things that I see is that the U.S. has its experience with the Cold War. We bring it to Asia. China hasn't had that experience. But the fact of the matter is that it's going to be necessary for these tools for managing conflicts to be homegrown in the Asian experience. And I think that's a particular challenge. Second is fourth, we've got the overhang actually from the Cold War structures and frameworks that still exist and actually get in the way because no one knows what is going to come. Ken mentioned the issue of uncertainty and anxieties related to power transition, and I think that that is a huge inhibiting factor for all of the states in terms of being able to move toward establishment of a new order. And then the fifth one, I think this is really the one, the point that I can make that is most directly related to U.S. strategy and a kind of gap in understanding in the region is related to how we have evolved in our views of alliances, where the U.S., I think, conception of the alliance frameworks, arguably has tried to focus on common values as the driving factor that would motivate alliance cooperation rather than threats. And yet clearly in the region, we see among some players an unwillingness to accept the idea that common values would be a driver for cooperation, and the idea that a perceived threat is really the only viable rationale for alliance cooperation. And then also I just want to kind of second and agree with what Ken had to say about trilateral security cooperation. It's really I think the new effort that is going on to try to grapple, at least in Northeast Asia, with some of the challenges that exist. But I think that we find that the forms and purposes of trilateralism thus far are disparate. And so you've got this Japan-China ROK cooperation, which is really functionally driven, very much along the lines, I guess, of the second layer, to a certain extent, of what Ken was talking about. But then you've also got this alliance-driven security cooperation mechanism among the U.S., Japan, and South Korea that is promoting collective security arrangements that in some ways is in opposition to a functionally driven cooperative security based trilateralism. And so you've got these competing images of trilateralism that are there. And so I don't have as many solutions like Paul has tried to suggest, but I think that hopefully, this treatment of some of the, issues and challenges related to getting beyond the form to the structure underneath can be useful in the discussion. So let me stop there.
Thank you, Scott, for suggesting or identifying the 5 challenges ahead of us, especially among this identity issue is quite critical. I think that we have to think about the mental foundation of the cooperation among ourselves while we are talking about the mechanism. So mental foundation of security cooperation is quite critical one. So understanding all the of national identity or regional identity is quite critical. And also the order, how they conceive the order. Nowadays, the Chinese Tensha is whether what that actually means to other countries' point of view is quite critical. But actually, you suggested the solution, the multilateralism, trilateral cooperation, it's overlaps actually that can create the mood for further comprehensive security cooperation or multilateral cooperation in the region. Maybe there's an intermediate step in gearing toward achievement of comprehensive multilateral security cooperation. So now I'd like to invite Dr. Chen.
Thank you very much, Chairman. The assignment given by Asan Institute is national or multilateral security. I'd like to touch upon this issue from 3 layers. The first is unilateral approach, and the second is bilateral approach, and the third is multilateral approach to understand the security situation or the security cooperation in this region. First, the unilateral approach. I'd like to take China as a case study. And if we have a study on the Chinese security perception since its founding from 1949, I think we can divide at least the 3 stages or periods of time. The first is ideology-oriented a perception on security. After the founding of the PRC, the first generation of Chinese leaders took the survival or the consolidation of the power of the legitimacy of the Communist Party in that country as the #1 job. And the second period of time is the trade-oriented, started from the open up and reform in the late 1970s under the leadership of our President Deng Xiaoping. And the third stage might be started from the new leadership, I think, from late 2011, when President Xi Jinping took the office as the President of China. And each period of time, I think China, had different perceptions on the security, on its security environment, and also China took different, attitude toward the security challenges China is facing. For example, during the trade-oriented period of time, China, took the trade for most of the time as the most important, policy toward the United States, European countries, Russia, and its neighboring countries. The result was that we enjoy the good relation in economy, in trade, with all the parties concerned, with China, with Russia, with the United States, and with our neighboring country, even with Japan. But we did enjoy a cold relationship for them with the countries like Japan and some other countries. So this is a very strange result of our trade-oriented policy in recent 30 years. So I think the new stage, under the new leadership of Xi Jinping, we have witnessed a serious adjustment. I cannot say it's a fundamental change, some adjustment. For example, the standoff between China and the Philippines over Huangyan Shao. Actually, Huangyan, Shao and its surrounding territories used to be the fishing grounds for the Chinese, for many centuries. And in recent years, especially during the 1990s and 1980s, the Filipinos used their, troops, arrested some Chinese fishermen, and also killing at least once a captain of a boat. So I think the response at that time was only to see something by our spokesman in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. But the standoff, between China and the Philippines in April 2012, that's really a fundamental change for China's maritime policy. And another standoff between China and Japan is over Doi Island in 2012. We worried about not only the purchase, the state purchase by the Japanese government, but also the next step. For example, what the result you can imagine if the Japanese side deploys civil servants or build up some permanent facilities on these islands. I think that's really fundamental change for the status. It's not a territorial issue only, but it's from the domestic approach we can see. I don't think that ordinary Chinese people would accept such a result. this is a challenge for our leaders. So I think that's the reason for China, or at least one of the reasons for China gave such a strong response to the purchase of Diaoyu Islands. So the standoff just to show the policy or the security perception of the new leaders toward the disputes in this region. And from the bilateral approach, I'd like to touch upon the Sino-US relation and established power and the rising power. During the last June's Sunnyland summit between our President Xi Jinping and President Obama, they all agreed to have a new model of major powers relationship. And of course, I think in recent months, we have heard some criticism in Washington, D.C. On this concept. It's a criticism to President Obama, saying that this is actually a trick by the Chinese side and only ask the United States to retreat, to give up their sphere of influence in Asia-Pacific region. So I think this is a new challenge for the two countries. How can the two big powers in this region cooperate in a bilateral approach? And also another aspect, I think, in recent, at least 1 year, our military has become very active and confident in male-to-male exchanges with their counterpart from the United States. We participate in the military exercise drills in Hawaii, and our military is going to participate in the RIMPAC exercise led by the United States. But when we talk about the interaction from the U.S. side, I think there are many obstacles. For example, the 12 areas limitation. We have at least nowadays 12 areas in the limitation of male-to-male exchanges. For example, actually, I heard a story recently that the cooperation between the military medical care exchanges, they first agreed from the U.S. side, but days later, they gave a response to our military, said, no, this time the U.S. military could not engage in such a cooperation with the PRA because of the act, adopted by the U.S. Congress. Military to military medical exchanges actually is one part of logistic cooperation, so we suspended. Actually, I think nowadays the Chinese military is well prepared to have active, confident military exchanges, but the United States side is not well prepared for such in-depth engagement or exchanges in military cooperation. So this is a new challenge for our two countries. In approach of the multilateral security cooperation, of course, I'd like to give you the example of a six-party talk. We heard some complaint from our neighboring countries, from the United States, from Morocco, many times on the pressure given by the Chinese government is not enough to pursue DPRK to be more behaved themselves. I can tell a story. I don't think China nowadays, has any, powerful leverage to behave DPRK since the normalization of relations with ROK in 2092. So before that year, I think the two countries at least had some permanent mechanism to have a consultation before any big decision to be made before they announced. So I think this time I don't think DPRK would like to listen to Chinese advice. But on the contrary, they prefer to have cooperation with the United States. We had several workshops and dealing with nuclear security and nuclear disarmament in this region with our counterparts. Our physicists, complained several times to me that the DPRK would like to invite the U.S. physicists to have site inspection, a site visit to Ningbian or to other nuclear facilities, but not the Chinese physicists. So our physicists, are jealous of the privilege enjoyed by the U.S. physics scientists. So this is the reality we are facing now. We have to, think about the Chinese role in this issue. Actually, to my understanding, our new leaders, adjust a little bit our policy toward Peninsula. We still insist on the three principles. For example, the first, denuclearization of the peninsula, the the stability of the peninsula, and we should solve all the issues or challenges through dialogue, through peaceful, diplomatic solution. So this is the judgment by our new leadership toward the nuclear issue in DPR, in DPRK. And we also have cooperations, for example, in aiding Bay and anti-piracy.
1 minute.
Okay. That's really successful in the cooperation among all the parties concerned, especially among China and the U.S. navies, and also NATO navies participate in the cooperation dealing with the non-traditional threat like the piracy. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Teng. Especially actually this, whether you can see any utility of six-party talks in promoting the issues other than North Korea. It was designed to solve North Korean problem, but actually September 19th joint statement and February 13th joint statement include the possibility of expanding the role of six-party talks, so that you can see the possibility of realizing that goal at the end of the day. Okay, I will come back to you, but lastly, but leastly, I'd like to have some objective observation from a distance, the European continent, with a rich experience of collective security and confidence building measures. Mr. Ghinst, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you, Professor Choi. I don't know whether with my NATO credentials that will qualify me as an objective observer of multilateralism. That being said, being a NATO bureaucrat, you won't be surprised to hear me preaching the virtues of multilateralism. A couple of points from a practitioner perspective. I mean, multilateralism is difficult. You need first to define a common agenda. Some nations may object to the insertion of a specific agenda of the meeting. Then you need to spend countless hours in committees to discuss the place of a comma or a paragraph in a text, which may eventually become the policy of the organization. Now, the dividends are obvious. I mean, once you have a common policy agreed, the dividends are there. You maximize your influence, you enlist the support of the international community, and this in turn makes international perception of action much more favorable. Now, multilateralism will always be one of the many instruments in the toolbox of nations' diplomatic kits. International organizations are, in a way, like living creatures. They evolve. And interestingly, NATO has gone through 3 historical chapters, a little bit like the PRC. The reality is that over the last 2 decades, we've spent more time on crisis management and cooperative security than on Article 5. And I'd like to share with you a couple of words on one of institutional setup, which is probably closer to what Professor Jimbo described as the associational form of multilateralism, and that is partnership. Through the last 2 decades, as I mentioned, NATO has run many different operations, and most of the operations were run with partners' participation. So we had to transform and adapt ourselves, including in terms of decision-making process, trying to make sure that these countries were associated to the decision-making process. And we were so able to meet with these countries and the North Atlantic Council whenever we were discussing these operations. Now, whenever Afghanistan is being discussed at this moment at NATO, you have 50 nations around the table, and you'd be surprised to hear that you have exotic nations like Tonga, Salvador, or Mongolia around the table because they are there to help us. But we have had also to develop institutional mechanisms to support these operational interaction on the ground. What is perhaps interesting is that you have various degrees of institutional commitment from the various countries, reflecting their political, the variety of political position. We have partner countries which are neutral countries, but that doesn't prevent them from cooperating with the alliance on a number of issues while preserving their neutral credentials. And to date we have forged partnership with 22 countries in Eastern Europe, Central Asia and the Caucasus. We have a Mediterranean dialogue involving 7 Northern African countries, the Istanbul Cooperation Initiative with 4 Gulf countries, and we have 8 partners across the globe, including the Republic of Korea. We have also developed a set of practical arrangements, and partners are free to select and choose activities. We have over 1,200 activities ranging from 32 areas of cooperation in arms control, airspace management, civil emergency planning, disaster relief. So actually the focus of the cooperation is very different. The cooperation we have with Japan focuses on essentially non-proliferation and disaster relief, humanitarian assistance, whereas for instance the core of the partnership arrangement with Australia is focusing on operational issues. And we also meet at the highest level. At the last summit in Chicago, the heads of state and government met with 13 partner countries, including 4 countries from this region. Now, if you want to promote cooperative security, there's one key ingredient, which is inclusiveness. And I'd like to share with you a couple of words, which is on the dialogue we've had with the Chinese authorities, because it is essential to dispel misunderstanding as we are pursuing and deepening our dialogue and the cooperation with countries in the region. We must maintain a balanced approach. Partnership and cooperative security cannot be exclusive. And that's why we have similarly tried to associate China. And for instance, we've had a meeting of the North Atlantic Council on counter-piracy involving a wide range of countries involved in the operations in the Gulf of Aden, and that included China, India, or Saudi Arabia. So these set of flexible arrangements allow us to be more open and transparent. Finally, I'd like to share a couple of thoughts on European security architecture and its lessons learned. And perhaps this session is the natural continuation of the previous Q&A session we just had. I'm wondering to which extent, I mean, when you talk about the European experience, it took many decades to find the compromise formula for the European Union to shoulder directly its security responsibility, basically up until '92, where there was the so-called Petersburg Agreement, allowing the European Union to shoulder directly its security responsibility. And it took many different institutions to find that compromise formula. In the meantime, you even had the Western European Union. So I think that is one useful element to keep in mind when we're talking about that in this very region. I believe there's one specific area where European experience can perhaps be a source of inspiration, because you can't simply cut and paste arrangement to this region. But it's confidence-building measures and arms control arrangements. We have had in Europe the so-called Helsinki process, and I think Professor Steinberg talked a little bit about that yesterday. But I think the Helsinki process, and it wasn't necessarily a time of romance between the Soviet Union and the United States. The Helsinki process was essential to introduce basically a set of measures, very practical measures. And by the way, it wasn't an institution, it was a forum, which later on became the OSCE. But initially, it was a very loose form of arrangement. And with the Helsinki process, we succeeded to introduce a set of practical measures, introducing what I would describe a sense of predictability in military affairs. And that's perhaps something which is very needed in this region, especially as tensions tend to flare up. And I think I'll limit my remarks to that, yes.
Thank you, especially just suggesting the confidence building measures and Helsinki process. I think that's what we need especially in Northeast Asia, since this kinds of conflict can flame up to the actual physical contact between the concerned parties. So how we can stabilize the situation, or how we can de-escalate the crisis once it happens. So like that's a quite critical things there. And also thanks for pointing out some painstaking work we have done over the years. Of course, when we talk about multilateral cooperation or multilateral dialogue, it's quite difficult or takes time to reach a consensus. But once we have a consensus, it has a momentum to sustainability is there. But that's a good point. And also, thanks for bringing up the European Union. But I don't know whether it's possible to have that kinds of organization or institutions separate from security cooperation in Northeast Asia or in East Asia. There's quality one. But actually there's a formula, East Asian Summit, and also the ARF is there. So what should be the proper division of labor between all the organizations? So we have time at, I think, maybe 3 questions. I'd like to open the floor for questions. Okay, please.
Leibson from the Stimson Center. I wanted to pick up between Gilles and Scott a couple of issues. One is that alliance relationships are sort of built in to be semi-permanent, that there's an assumption of sort of long durability of shared threat perception. And as Scott said, really sometimes the uncertainty in East Asia suggests that it's really quite difficult to freeze frame what is the threat environment that you're building for. So it's the timing, the permanence of alliances versus partnerships. So I was appreciated that you talked about how much NATO has switched from just the core allies to these partnerships, which are much more agile and ad hoc. And I wonder, so I guess my question to both of you is, when we think of non-traditional security cooperation, disaster management, climate adaptation, migration problems perhaps, the whole list, whether formal military alliances are really too heavy an instrument for the kind of cooperation that is required in the 21st century. So changing security agenda, is partnership actually the smarter, more agile way to go than alliance structures, which almost feel anachronistic these days? So I just welcome any comments on that.
Okay, I can take 2 more questions. If not, please. Scott, would you like to respond to the question?
Oh, okay. I thought you were going to take, okay, no other questions.
Yeah,
Got
no
it.
other questions, sir.
I was too busy thinking of my answer. You know, I think that actually NATO, the U.S.-Korea alliance, and the U.S.-Japan alliance are outliers if we look at the history of alliances. I mean, normally, I think the average duration of alliances in a study that I'm aware of over the course of the past 150 years has been a decade. And yet these alliances have lasted 50, 60 years. And so this is an unusual circumstance that we're dealing with. And I think that what we're seeing in the context of the rebalance is actually a preference for a diversification that is focused on less institutionalized relationships than alliances. And I think that, in fact, the alliance framework also does carry with it some kinds of burdens, you know, most notably the permanent presence that can be particularly costly in terms of local management of relations at the local level. And so I think it's fair to suggest that there may well be, I think there is an evolution going on. But it's also, I think, true that in the East Asian context, precisely because we don't know what's coming next, the existing alliances also are bolstered as a hedge against that uncertainty.
Okay, Ken?
Yeah, I think it's a wonderful question, but in terms of dealing with the power balance and the rise of China questions, even though the alliance has less focus on the defined target as we had during the Cold War, you still have the function of dealing with a regional contingency like a Korean Peninsula, if possible, you know, the Taiwan issues, and also remaining like a stability question that includes the maritime security domain as well. And if you look at the balance of power and the whole distribution of the military power, engaging in Korean Peninsula in the 1990s and then as of today is so much different. You need a higher level of the operational access to deal with the A2AD questions, which China may potentially pose upon the U.S. operational capability in the Northeast Asia. So even though we do have the hedging as the policy tool, but in order to, I think, achieve the hedging, you have to have the heavy force still in Northeast Asia. And the second is that even though I mentioned that the second layer of the functional cooperation has been the emerging agenda, but I think if you look at the actual case of how we experience the second layer cooperation, such as like a Sumatra, such as like a Leyte Hainan incidents, it is the layer one cooperation that took the initiative for facilitating such kind of multilateral operation. So I think it still has a very huge utility of the functioning of the layer one, which is alliance-based cooperation, to bridge the future capacity of the layer two and layer three cooperation. That's my understanding.
Okay, thanks. Brad?
Brad Glosserman, Pacific Forum. Paul, as always, thank you for some insightful dissection of these issues. And I'm really intrigued by your distinction between order and architecture. And so I would throw up into the entire group, as we question whether or not we're moving to a G0 world, which suggests that order itself is at risk, are there principles of order that the six, Choi or Kang, you can answer as well, principles of order that you can agree on that are actually meaningful as opposed to being so open-ended and mellifluous that they're meaningless? In other words, denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula strikes me as meaningless in the absence of any secondary or tertiary kind of thoughts about what priority you attach to that and where you go with that.
Okay. Paul?
Order and architecture. It was fascinating a few minutes ago when we had the session before this, when Jim Steinberg was talking about what he saw as the essential issues that there has to be an understanding on before the region can live with a higher degree of certainty about where it's going. And all of them were place-specific: North Korea, Taiwan, and maritime disputes. It was fascinating that the Chinese colleague who spoke didn't address any particular dispute, but talked about structural change, and in essence, how a rising China is going to be brought into an alignment with others in the region. And I think that really spoke to a tension that is hard in this kind of discussion. Most of us want to talk about multilateralism, bilateral instruments for solving immediate conflicts, immediate problems, whether they be humanitarian and on the non-traditional security side, or really tough questions, like the North Korean nuclear problem. And my sense is that the order issue now is a bigger one, that it's having to do with structural uncertainty and what kind of principles can be built in. And if what I said was rather abstract, but if you were an architect recommending to governments what you do in the East Asia Summit process, where essentially for the first time there's an opportunity with representatives of most of the major countries, in fact all of the important ones except Canada in the East Asia Summit process. What are going to be the principles of interaction in the East Asia Summit process? And my guess is that Brad's question about how can they be more practical, how can they move ahead in a clear-headed way rather than be amorphous, is exactly the question that is coming out of Southeast Asia. Southeast Asia, the ASEAN way, ASEAN approaches, have only worked to a certain kind of point. What can be those principles? And there's many of them that we're trying to come up with a blueprint for what some of them could be. But I would use one that is essential, which is self-restraint, which is the limitation on what you try to achieve, not because you don't have the capabilities to do it, but because you feel in doing so that you're going to jeopardize a bigger system. And for our Chinese friends, this has been immensely difficult around the South China Sea question and some of the maritime disputes. Why should China make concessions on some of these things a priori before going into them? And our argument is that just as the United States, just as the American allies are going to have to make some special concessions, that keeping this valuable East Asia system together, this is the golden goose that is providing. Everyone has a common interest in economic interdependence and the kinds of growth that have taken place over the last, 2, 3, 4 decades. And so what are you willing to give up in advance? Now this sounds impossible or difficult. Europe in other periods have had major powers that have been willing and able to do that because they saw a system that was in their interests. Political parties can do that domestically.
I'm forced to end this session because the network lunch is waiting for us. I'd like to thank each and every one of the speakers on this panel. So I think they have given us a huge food for thought for further investigation and further deliberation. Join me in thanking this excellent presentation